This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Well, our next guest is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, a retired CIA officer, and a retired U.S. Marine reservist, having served for 2 decades as both a commissioned and enlisted Marine. Carol, he's also the co-founder of the Lobo Institute. It's an organization that, in its own words, quote, advises, consults, and teaches on current and future conflicts, how to end conflicts and prevent their recurrence, and how to help those who've been most affected.
Very pleased to have with us Mick Mulroy on Zoom from Montana. Mick, nice to have you here with Tim and myself. So many questions. Iran, what do they know? U.S. aid to Iran, Russia maybe looking to distract, the focus off Ukraine. There's so many things being floated. China, President Xi not addressing what happened in terms of the conflict. If you were back at the CIA, what are the scenarios that you would be coming up with for President Biden and the U.S. national security teams?
So good to be with you all. There's many issues to be addressed. Of course, this was an intelligence failure, predominantly by the Israelis, but also, quite frankly, by the United States and other regional actors. And that does have to be addressed, but it's not the most pressing. Right now, we'd be talking about the hostages. We, of course, have responsibility for American hostages. They are, it looks like, up to 100, many of them who are in Gaza right now. There are reports that they are in tunnels, and the tunnels are wired. So a traditional hostage rescue would be exceptionally difficult. And I think we're going to have to look at our partners in the region, Egypt, Qatar, that have some kind of leverage over Hamas to try to recover all the hostages, of course, including the Americans. So that's one effort I think that we would need to look at. The other effort we need to look at is just how involved Iran was in this operation. There's many indicators. It was a very complex operation. There was technical devices that brought down the communications in Israel. And obviously the weaponry and the equipment does indicate that Iran was involved. There's also been reporting that they were involved, but I think the IC needs to make a determination of just what their level of involvement is, because that would go toward potentially freezing the $6 billion that we just negotiated. And then, of course, what to be done against Iran, if anything, if they were directly responsible for this.
Well, let's start with the hostages part of this, because hostages have long been a part of I don't want to say relations, but they've long been a part of the skirmishes between Palestinians and Israelis, namely on the Palestinian side. But prisoner swaps have often occurred, sometimes after years of holding hostages. But 150 hostages, Mick, this is a huge, huge number. What is Hamas looking for with holding these people hostage?
It is definitely a huge number, and the complexity of that from a military trial recovery would be enormous, on top of all the other things I already mentioned. So I think what are they trying to get from that? They're probably going to use hostages as human shields. So every place that they think the Israelis are likely to strike and are striking right now, there may be a hostage, unfortunately, in those locations. They're going to use them for bargaining tools. They've already announced that they're going to start executing a hostage every hour on the hour. That would put a lot of pressure on Israel to mitigate what is coming, which is likely a ground invasion into Gaza. They're going to use them to try to recover their own prisoners that are held inside Israel, Hamas prisoners, for example, to try to recover them. They're going to use them, unfortunately, all against the law of armed conflict and every international protocol. Most of them are civilians, but obviously Hamas does not care about that.
Mick, I do wonder what you see as the biggest concern and risk for the world right now as we watch this. It's very easy, I think, sometimes, unfortunately, for folks who are not in it. We just talked with our Ethan Bronner, who is in Tel Aviv. He's our Israel bureau chief, and so is hearing it, seeing it firsthand. But the world has to be concerned about increasingly all of these geopolitical events, whether it's Ukraine or what's going on in Israel right now. What do you see as the biggest risk right now?
So I think the biggest risk regarding this conflict is that Iran decides to engage all of its proxies to come at every different angle into Israel. So if they initiate Lebanese Hezbollah, for example, or they just initiate themselves. They have about 150,000 rockets and missiles that they could launch into Israel, which would overwhelm any system, any air defense system, including the Iron Dome. And they also have militias in Syria. So if this happened, I think that the United States would become more and more likely to get directly involved militarily, as it could overwhelm the IDF and the security services in Israel. And that could lead to a much broader regional war, potentially bring in Iran directly. And that, of course, would be another war in the Middle East. And this one, very substantial.
We'll talk about that a little bit.
On top of what's happening right now.
Yeah, Mick, talk about that a little bit in the U.S.'s involvement and what you, in your opinion, think that the U.S. should actually do, not just to rescue the Americans who've been held hostage, but also to make sure that parties, whoever they are at this point, are held accountable for what happened on Saturday and what continues to happen in Israel.
So militarily, the Pentagon announced the deployment of an aircraft carrier strike group, so the Gerald R. Ford strike group. That's one aircraft carrier, 2 destroyers, and 2 cruisers. It's substantial, and it's going to be parked right off of Israel, quite frankly. That is both a deterrence, so that if any other country might be thinking about jumping into this, they have to consider that presence right there, which is an incredible amount of military capability. The second thing that I think the United States is already doing, we keep pre-planned munitions pre-staged in Israel for our own purposes. Israel, I believe, has already asked to be able to get access to that, and I think we're going to do that. That's a lot of ammunition that they can use in their ground offensive at a time when ammunition and weapons are in a shortage all around the world, like mostly from the Ukraine conflict. And the third is, I think, help them with intelligence. Obviously, that's been an issue, but they need intelligence to be able to accurately plan their upcoming ground invasion, and I think the United States can do that all before becoming directly involved. That is likely where the United States is right now.
Your Lobo Institute, it's all about conflicts, current, future, otherwise, and you advise clients about this and consult on this specifically at a time when we still have a war in Ukraine, and now we have this. What's the message to global companies, to governments about security issues, international security issues at a time like today? And just got about a minute, unfortunately.
Yeah, certainly understand. So thanks for bringing up Lobo Institute. It is a group of people not only that were in the agency and the military, but also in the UN, for example, USAID. So it really covers the gamut of both your military types and your essentially humanitarian types. And that is really what the message is of Lobo Institute, is that it is not just one tool to help end conflicts, it's multiple tools. For example, if the economic conditions in some countries don't improve, then we're always going to have a terrorist issue from that country. It's a matter of fact. So that's what we focus on. We work for the UN, we work for the US State Department in areas where it's seemingly endless wars continue to happen, and unfortunately, wars continue to be started.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much. We so appreciate your insight on this difficult day, and just trying to make some sense out of it, certainly for all of the Bloomberg audiences that are out there. Mick Mulroy, thank you so much. On Zoom from Montana. He's co-founder of the Lobo Institute. He's also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a retired CIA officer, and so much more. So incredible insight and perspective on this.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 3 to 6 Eastern. Listen on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here on Bloomberg Businessweek. Our coverage of the Hamas-Israel conflict continues. To be fair, conflict feels like an easy word. Hamas really attacking Israel over the weekend. Saturday's surprise attack on Israel by the Palestinian group may represent one of the biggest failures by Israeli intelligence since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. We've been talking about this. The attack involved dozens of infiltrations by land and sea, together with rocket attacks, a sophisticated assault, but as we just talked about, that it was also in some ways, very basic in terms of gliders, right? And bulldozers. Like, it wasn't necessarily technologically sophisticated, but nonetheless, it was rather broad. And it definitely took some kind of planning to get into it. And
it was certainly one that intelligence agencies missed, and they were supposed to pick up on. That's a bigger conversation. For now, though, let's get to Dr. Ariel Cohen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's also a consultant where he works with companies, NGOs, and governments on international security, oil, and gas strategy. He's got a client list that includes Fortune 500 companies, as well as USAID, the World Bank, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Senate. He's also been in the Israeli Defense Forces. He served in the IDF, Israel's national military. Very pleased to have you join us, Dr. Cohen, this afternoon. How are you?
I'm very worried. Families called up in reserves, friends of friends being killed, and the horrible pictures of close to 1,000 Israelis, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians killed. Also people from Nepal, people from Thailand murdered in cold blood, children taken hostage to Gaza, 85-year-olds in wheelchair killed, parents executed in front of their children. Horrible, horrible images.
So how does this happen, and how does Israeli intelligence, which is considered top among the world, how does it fail?
Israel right now is in a response mode into Gaza and very concerned about possible escalations in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Lebanon, where Hezbollah, the fully owned subsidiary of Iran, is aiming tens of thousands of more powerful rockets than those from Gaza on Haifa, Tel Aviv, and other cities. And the accounting for this failure is going to come, but it's probably going to come later on after the shooting stops. In the meantime, yes, you're absolutely right. It's an intelligence failure of historic proportions, like the Yom Kippur War or worse, because during the war, Yom Kippur War, it was soldiers who were killed. It was armies who clashed, not peaceful villagers and attendees of a rave in the desert who were surrounded and murdered. 260 people were killed in a rave, young people. So in that respect, it's worse. The accounting, probably the Judiciary Inquiry Commission, like the Agranat Commission of 1974, is probably going to happen. I cannot imagine Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, the Mossad director, the Shin Bet Security Service director, the chief of intelligence for the army, and the chief of staff for the army to keep their jobs after this.
That's a long list of people, Dr. Cohen. As we just heard a few minutes ago from our own Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg headline crossing that said Delta Airlines will cancel its flights to and from Tel Aviv through October 31st. Certainly, Delta Airlines thinks the conflict is going to last until at least the end of the month, when they're going to revisit whether they do flights there. How do you see this playing out?
Well, first of all, this concerns me because my daughter and her husband are supposed to fly back to Israel this week on Delta. My daughter runs Cyberwell, an online organization that fights anti-Semitism in social media. I see it.
Would she have returned?
No, she's in the States right now.
But would she have returned on her ticket if it was available?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. She has a crew of colleagues to run. She's the CEO of this nonprofit. And she would go back. Possibly she would be called up because she served in the IDF as well.
We should note that we should note. I just want to jump in. We should note that El Al, the flag carrier for Israel, the nation's carrier, has increased the number of flights to try to bring Israelis back to Israel who have been called up.
And Israelis are volunteering to go back from all over the world to go save their country. I say save deliberately because the threat. The threat to the cities and villages of Israel, not just from Gaza, but also from Hamas presence in the West Bank, Islamic Jihad, which is fully supported and funded by Iran, and from Hezbollah. This is an existential threat, And if it escalates to the point where big cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv are bombed severely, if there is a threshold of victims of killed and wounded, I estimated roughly around 10,000. If that reaches these numbers,
right.
Israel may retaliate up to and including unconventional warfare against Iran.
Do you mean nuclear weapons?
Unconventional warfare. And by the way, the fact that we, the United States, are moving the carrier battle group to Eastern Mediterranean is a strong warning to the Islamic Republic and its leaders and to Syria not to escalate. And if they don't heed that warning, I do not exclude a situation in which the United States and Israel go for a joint operation for the first time in history.
What's the risk for Israel of doing too much, retaliating too much, and what's the risk of not doing enough?
Israel did not retaliate too much for 20 years, give or take, since 2007, when Israel fully evacuated Gaza, when Gaza had an airport, a seaport, agriculture, and all Israeli settlements were relocated out of Gaza. And then Hamas started shooting rockets, and the blockade on the Israeli side, with the Egyptian border still open, came into play. And even with that, when you look at pictures, at photographs of Gaza in between these escalations, there were restaurants, there were shops open. They were not starving by any stretch of imagination. And deliberate escalation by Hamas leadership led to what just happened, including taking people hostage, including many, many victims on Israeli side. But also, there has to be, unfortunately, victims among civilian populations when Israel targets and hits Hamas command posts, Hamas rocket launchers, etc. Now, going forward, I think Israel got to a point where it will try to destroy the Hamas command structure and Palestinian Islamic Jihad command structure. If this will lead to the collapse of the Hamas theocratic dictatorship, don't forget, a lot of people in Gaza back in the day when the last elections happened in 2005 voted for Hamas, and now the little public opinion research that happens indicates that half or more of residents of Gaza may have had enough with these fanatics.
We were speaking with Dr. Ariel Cohen, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Good to get his thoughts.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 3 to 6 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and YouTube. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
All right, we do want to go to our next guest because continuing to cover the attack in Israel and understand the situation at large, if you will, Tim. And we keep talking about size and scope. It's something we're all about at Bloomberg, but really understanding the significance of what happened, this surprise attack, and what ultimately it means longer term.
Yeah, very pleased to have with us Danon, senior member of the Knesset or Parliament, also sits on Israel's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, former Deputy Defense Minister, former Israeli ambassador to the UN. He's also chairman of the World Likud Party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Ambassador Danon is with us from Tel Aviv. Ambassador, good to have you with us this afternoon. I think a question that so many people are asking is, how did Israeli security apparatus miss this?
You know, today we had a very long discussion on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee exactly about this issue. And I think it will take us some time to do the proper inquiry. But we can admit, and we have to admit, we were caught by surprise, exactly like what happened 50 years ago on Yom Kippur War. The terrorists took advantage of a Jewish holiday, and we were caught by surprise. But, you know, it's more than just a surprise. We were not ready for the brutality, for the barbaric approach of those militias. When they entered Israel, they didn't attack military bases. They went to peaceful communities on the border, dragged families out of their homes, executed them, and dragged dozens of them into Gaza. And today, when we start to count the numbers, it's very hard for us. More than 1,000 victims in one day. We never saw such atrocities since the days of the Holocaust. So for us to see those videos and footage of barbaric terrorists entering homes, taking elderly people and kids and committing a massacre, it is very hard for us. We feel the pain in Israel, all of us, but we gather the strength to stand up and to fight back. And we will start to fight back in the next few days.
As you say, this is unusual, especially for the attack on civilians. Hard to ever make sense in a situation like this. But how do you think about this approach that we saw by Hamas in terms of this attack?
Well, we shouldn't look for logic when you deal with terrorists. Same for 9/11 with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's not the same logic way we think about goals and moving forward. We left Gaza. We left Gaza 18 years ago. We took out all the Jewish communities, and we hope that it will be a peaceful entity next to us. Then look what happened. Hamas took over, kicked out the Palestinian Authority, and it became a hub for terrorism. And all the funds that the international community spends on Gaza goes for terrorism, for digging tunnels, developing the techniques, and we saw their capabilities. They came from the sea, from the air, from tunnels, and the main goal was to sow destruction in our communities, chaos, and they think that maybe it will serve them, but they will learn very soon that it was a grave mistake. They will pay a heavy price. We will hunt them down, and I think they will feel the might of the IDF in the near future. And I call the government of Israel to make a very clear statement that the goal of the operation should be to eradicate Hamas, period, to finish it, not to have another round and then a ceasefire, because then we will wake up in a few years with another attack.
Mr. Ambassador, how do you eradicate Hamas from Gaza?
Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge it's not going to be an easy task. It will require a lot of effort, but basically you have to conquer the land and to make the distinction between the population and the militants. As we speak, we're sending messages to certain neighborhoods in Gaza, calling for the residents to move out from those neighborhoods. We do not have a desire to hurt civilian population. Unlike Hamas, they commit a double war crime. They target civilians, and then they hide behind civilians, and they use them as human shields. We have the exact opposite goal, is to minimize the casualties among civilians, and we're trying to convince them to move away from the strategic Hamas headquarters.
Ambassador, how do you do this, though? We talked about if Iran, although our officials have come out and said, specifically, I'm talking about our National Security Council spokesman, John Kirby, talking on MSNBC, on CNN, saying that they do not have any specific intelligence or evidence that points to direct participation by Iran in these attacks against Israel. But if indeed, and Israel moves forward with some deep retaliation, and ultimately if Iran is involved in some way and you engage Iran, and then, as we heard from an earlier guest, Iran and all of its proxies, whether it's Syria, whether it's Lebanon, how do you avoid this not getting out of control worse than it is already?
So Iran is very involved in everything in the region. They spend billions on promoting chaos, instability, funding Hamas and Hezbollah, and training both proxies. And we know that they are very involved. There are some speculation about, their desire to block a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And maybe that's why, because there is no reason for the timing. Nothing happened. It was an unprovoked attack. So maybe one of the speculations that they wanted to delay any progress in the negotiations with the Saudis. But the Iranians should know that we are not playing games. If Hezbollah will attack us, we will retaliate, and it will be painful for Hezbollah and also for the Lebanese people.
We have seen the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, talking via television earlier this evening, talking about unifying the party. How important is that, and how likely is that in this environment?
So I think it's time for unity. I think we understand now that we don't have the luxury of arguing on internal domestic issues. The enemy of Hamas, they do not make the distinction between coalition and opposition. And I hope that we will have a unity government soon.
Is it likely? Is it likely from what you are hearing?
Yes, I think it's moving to that direction. It's not going to last forever, but for the time we are involved in a war against Hamas, I think it can be helpful. The people of Israel, we are under a very major emotional stress in the last few days. Seeing those footage, knowing that today, as we speak, you have kids, toddlers, at the age of 3 years old, in the hand of Hamas, women that they were raped and dragged into Gaza. This is, we built a Jewish state in order to protect the Jewish people, and we never thought that somebody will come into Israel and commit such an horrible atrocity against us.
Ambassador, just in the last...
I think a unity government is the right thing.
Just in the last minute that we have with you, how far geographically is Israel willing to go to defend itself? Is it willing to go to Iran? Is it willing to go to the north? Is it willing to go, we know it's willing to go into Gaza. How far is it willing to go?
And we just have about 25, 30 seconds, please.
We don't have a desire to expand the war. We focus on the war against Hamas, period. But if we will not have a choice, we will go anywhere around the world to protect ourselves.
All right, we're going to leave it at that note. Be well and be safe. Danon, senior member of the Knesset Parliament, sitting on Israel's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, former Deputy Defense Minister, former Israeli ambassador to the UN, chairman of the World Likud Party, of course, of the Prime Minister. And he, of course, was joining us from Tel Aviv.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 3 to 6 Eastern. Listen on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
We're going to continue on with that surprise Hamas attack on Israel. One of the big questions, what Iran knew, what will be the geopolitical responses and alliances as a result of the attack. As for Iran, Iran may have known about the deadly attacks by Hamas militants, although a U.S. official coming out on various cable channels and saying, at this point, intelligence is saying, no, they did not know anything about this attack. So let's get into it, because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel says, we're going to change the Middle East in a big way. And you do wonder about how things are going forward.
We've got a couple of great guests with us this afternoon. Major General retired Mastin, Robeson, a geopolitical intelligence advisor at Academy Securities. Also with us, we have Academy Securities Director and Head of Macro Strategy, Tchir, joining us this afternoon. I want to start with you, Major General. Really appreciate you taking the time. What do you think when you hear Benjamin Netanyahu say that we are going to change the Middle East?
Yeah, he wants to send a loud, resounding message to his people that this won't be tolerated, and the time has come to take the gloves off, and Hamas will pay a heavy, heavy price. That's the easy part. The hard part is, does this also draw in Lebanese Hezbollah? Does it draw in Syria? Does it draw in Iran? Does it draw in even Russian support? That'll be the calculus that's really unknown right now. But I think the embarrassment that Israel is feeling right now of having been surprised, and the population having put their complete trust in both the advanced warning and the security architecture they're used to, the Prime Minister has got to do something significant enough to regain that confidence and to establish to the rest of the Middle East, Israel is not to be trifled with. It's the only way they'll survive.
You make me think, Major General, of my conversation that Carol and I just had with Ambassador Danon. I asked him, I posed that question to him, how far geographically is Israel willing to go to defend its borders? Is it going to go attack Hezbollah? Is it going to go attack Iran? Is it going to go beyond Hamas and Gaza? And he told us, Carol, right now we are focusing on Hamas and eradicating Hamas, but we will go as far as we need to go around the world in order to protect Israel.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't want to start speculating that they're going to go further than Hamas. But Israel has always believed, right, wrong, or indifferent, that virtually every country within, 500 miles is part of their enemy. I don't think that's realistically true today. I think that there's some strong, possibilities of relationships that they're going to want to not unravel if they can keep from doing so. And keep in mind that there are a number of Middle East countries that are still under the Accords, the Abraham Accords, that they're still held to. So you would think that they, in this particular case, that Saudi and Jordan and UAE, and that they would sit this out. But there's no guarantee that it's hard to believe that Hamas planned this and executed something this complicated all by itself. No proof yet that Iran was involved, but they certainly would not surprise anybody if Iran or Hezbollah were involved, at least in the planning. And of course, if Hezbollah gets involved, they've got at least a 2, if not a 3-front war that Israel is dealing with. And
that's what we're all worried about. And that certainly was one of the concerns, I would say, earlier in the day in the financial markets here in the United States. Peter, come on in on this. You're head of macro strategy over at Academy Securities. Geopolitics, I don't have to tell you, has lots of market implications, short and then sometimes longer term. We saw it play out in oil prices, a little bit of a flight to safety, defense stocks here in the U.S. Airlines are under pressure. We definitely saw it play out today. Energy names on the equity side of things certainly rallying. What are you keeping an eye on? What are you telling clients? What are you being asked?
I think about all of the above, I guess. I would say we kind of start what seems most obvious. Like oil should continue to go higher with this, right? There is a threat to oil supply chains. So I see oil going higher as one thing. I also think rates are going to go lower, though. So despite higher oil, yes, that would seem inflationary. The Fed's not going to worry about that. The markets aren't going to worry about that. You have a flight to safety. So you're seeing rates go lower. The Fed spoke today and actually kind of already fell into the camp that I think we've been saying before this occurred, no more hikes this year. So that helped equities. And I think equities are kind of the wild card. Do they follow the bad news as good because yields are lower? Or do they start getting worried about what this means for the global economy? All of a sudden you have the U.S. potentially helping allies on 2 fronts. What does it mean for the rest of the world? So I think equities are really the wild card. They responded nicely today to lower yields. I think that might continue, but I'd want to pare back risk if this is going to escalate.
Hey, Peter, if I may follow with you, how does this complicate maybe the Fed's world? 2 more meetings, November 1, December 13th. We get FOMC minutes this week from the most recent meeting. We get reads on inflation. But how does potentially, and again, we're it looks like starting on 4 days in terms of the attack on Israel, and we don't know what's going to happen the rest of the week or how long this goes on. But how does this potentially complicate the Fed thinking about monetary policy and maybe looking to ease conditions a little bit, although the market has done a lot of the Fed's work as of late?
Yeah, I think the Fed has been, and they do not want to do anything. So I think they've been looking for the data to give them excuses to do nothing. And unfortunately, this probably gives them the excuse to do nothing. They are certainly not going to hike in the face of this frustration. People might talk about oil prices going higher. They will ignore that, right? They will view it as transitory. It's something beyond their control. So they won't ease anytime soon. But I think this takes any hike conversations off the table for now.
Hey, Major General, I want to bring you back into the conversation and ask you about the U.S.'s role here and to what extent do you think that the U.S. should get involved beyond sending a carrier and a group of ships on its way from the Mediterranean right now. Look, Americans have been killed. We have reason to believe, per Hamas, that Americans have been captured. That's what we heard from our Washington, D.C. reporter just a few minutes ago. What should the U.S. involvement be?
Yeah, I don't think any doubt the U.S. will be involved when it comes to munitions, when it comes to naval activity, collection architecture, jets. But keep in mind, Israel is extraordinarily well equipped. The question is how long the war goes and how deep their munitions supply set is. And we would certainly help them with that. And the other piece that I think we could is we could certainly work behind the scenes with the other Gulf states like Saudi Arabia to try to facilitate, a more neutral status with them, or even a diplomatic status with them, to try to bring this to a closure on a quicker pace. But we'd have to give something up to do that.
Well, that's why I think this was so surprising to so many people, Major General, is that anyone who's been to Israel understands the might of the Israeli military. You can't go anywhere in the country without seeing members of the IDF, Carol, carrying automatic weapons at bus stations. It's a normal, everyday thing. That's why it's so surprising that Hamas militants were able to get so far so quickly and into so many different military bases in such a short period of time.
Which, General, makes us think about this intelligence failure. How are you thinking about that? And concerns about, what might be being missed currently as we speak?
Yeah, so absolutely the intelligence failure and the security architecture's response was a failure. But just like in America, when something catastrophic happens, no matter how bad the failure was, it has a bonding effect and it brings a country together. So I don't think you're going to see Israelis that are throwing pot shots at the government. They're saying, how do we survive? What do I need to do? And that's the beauty of Israel, is every single person in that country considers them part of the security architecture. And they are all going to be, whether it's intelligence, whether it's gathering, or whether it's manning a weapon or a security station, they're going to be all in for survival. In their mind, they are surrounded by enemy, and they have nothing but complete loss of survival as an end state if they can't be successful.
We've heard the Prime Minister already calling for unification within his government. Peter Tchir, really quickly, 10 seconds. What's top of mind for you as we head into a busy week for the markets?
I think one thing we all have to watch is where this heads on social media, right? Who wins the kind of social media war? So I think there's going to be an intelligence operation on our side. They're going to combat this, and that becomes the risk that this escalates into a us versus them and goes beyond just a regional battle, in which case then I think yields go much lower, but stocks have to fall in that case.
Peter Tchir and Major General Mastin Robeson of Academy Securities, thank you both so much.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, 18 minutes left to go in the first trading session of the week. Of course, it is Monday, October 9th. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here at Bloomberg headquarters in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. And we've got a little bit of a rally underway here. Who'd have thunk, considering the news flow over the weekend, the attack on Israel by Hamas, and we're trying to gauge it. Of course, the bond market is closed here in the United States. We have
maybe that's why.
A safe haven bid. No, that's a really good point, because I think before on Friday, we teased forward and saying it's going to be bank earnings, it's going to be inflation reads here in the United States.
Yeah,
it's
CPI
going
Thursday.
To be Fed minutes, and yet we're definitely top of mind, something very different at this
Maybe
hour.
the Fed speakers we heard from today are driving this market. That's certainly what it feels like. Let's see what David Dietze has to say. Our Drive to the Close guest this afternoon, Senior Portfolio Strategist at Peapack Private Wealth Management, joining us from Summit, New Jersey this afternoon. David, how are you?
Doing great, Tim and Carol. Happy to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us on what we've certainly consider a somber day, given everything that we've been talking about over the last hour. We are Bloomberg, though. We are a show focused on markets, and we are just 17 minutes away from the close on this kind of holiday trading day, I think you could call it. How do you explain the turnaround in equities that we saw today?
Well, certainly there was a knee-jerk reaction for safe haven buying and all sorts of things like bonds and the dollar, and to buy up, of course, energy out of fear of energy supplies. But I think during the course of the day, you put your finger on it, Tim, there was some dovish talk from Federal Reserve officials talking about how the bond market has done a lot of our work for us, and therefore maybe we're best off just taking a wait-and-see attitude. And we have seen the odds of a rate hike by the Fed in November go down just since Friday. So that's a big positive. But I think also cooler heads have said, what are the possibilities of a huge spike in oil because of this? And quite frankly, the world today is so much different than it was 50 years ago in the Yom Kippur War. We are energy sufficient here. Palestine and Israel are not big energy producers. There's a couple offshore.
Yeah, but the concern isn't that, we're going to see disruptions from Israel and Palestine. The concern is that it'll set off some sort of broader conflict, and we'll see broader supply destructions within the region because the region is a huge oil supplier.
You are absolutely right, and the real problem is if it turns out that Iran was a big supporter or somehow helped instigate this attack by Hamas, that could reinstitute or cause the United States to reinstitute embargoes on their production. It could also halt a thaw in relationships that we're seeing between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Here is the wild card which could throw everything into a tailspin, is that Straits of Hormuz. 20 million barrels of oil pass through there regularly. That is the economic choke point for the world. If for some reason Iran were to put a blockade there, all bets are off, but that's certainly not the way you want to bet right now.
And energy certainly has been a bet that you have made, David. Talk to us about how you're looking at it on this Monday.
Yeah, absolutely. So longer term, all the think tanks say we are going to be using more oil by the end of this decade than we do now. We're going to be using more oil by the year 2050. So demand is going to continue. There's many areas of the world, particularly in Asia, which are not prepared financially or otherwise to make a big, fast switch to green. At the same time, of course, producers are saying, gee, we're getting negative vibes from governments and policymakers. They don't want us to produce. They're putting more and more barriers in the way. We may not be able to make a return on investment, and so therefore supply is starting to drop. Demand continues. That's a recipe for higher prices.
So where do you commit money still in the energy space?
Well, stay diversified, but we can't overlook the fact that the largest player, publicly traded player out there, Exxon, is making a potentially $60 billion bet on another company which has all these resources in the Permian. If a company like Exxon felt that oil didn't have a strong future, why would they do that? I think there's another thing at play there.
And of course, you're talking about Pioneer Natural Resources.
Pioneer Natural Resources, and that deal has not been confirmed, but
Correct.
It looks like it's well on its way. So here's the thing. So what I think is going on is a company like Exxon saying because of the low equity valuations out there, it's cheaper to drill, as it were, on Wall Street than to actually spend money to hire people and commit resources in IRL, in the real world. And therefore, I'm taking my cue there and saying, well, if a company like Exxon thinks it's cheaper to buy oil companies rather than drill, I think that as part of a diversified portfolio makes a lot of sense. Plus, if you like dividends and you're worried about potential inflation and, for example, geopolitical risks as we saw today, good addition to your portfolio.
What about Chevron, which Israel ordered the shutdown of a major gas field run by Chevron in the Eastern Mediterranean? So there were some safety concerns as the fighting continues on. Thoughts specifically on Chevron?
Yeah, we like Chevron, low debt, member of the Dow, wonderful management under, I believe it's Mr. Worth there. They are, diversified globally, integrated, so they're in all facets. Now, mind you, the fact that Israel asked them to stop work on one of their platforms, that's kind of a detail right now because it's a very small part of their overall production, and Israel doesn't have the capability to cut off a lot of oil. But that is good, but we also like Exxon. I think for a lot of reasons, people are more skeptical of Exxon. I think the valuation is lower. They're more geographically diversified, and over the long run, I wouldn't want to bet against Exxon either.
Okay, well, before we let you go, just in the last 2 minutes that we have with you, I want to talk about what we have upcoming. We hear from some of the big banks already starting this week. We got some inflation numbers coming on Thursday. We got consumer sentiment on Friday. What's the most important in the near-term catalyst?
I think those inflation numbers, the inflation numbers have been driving the higher interest rates and driving the hawkishness in the Fed. If we see something that looks like it's getting way too hot, I think that puts the market into lockdown as they worry about what the Fed's reaction is going to be. And, of course, it can work the other way around. On the earnings, obviously, you buy stocks for earnings. The problem is Q3 earnings are going to be the fourth quarter in a row of negative year-over-year results. So you're not going to have a whole lot to point to say, hey, let's go commit a lot more money in the market. And also, I think they're going to be cautious on the outlook. How can they not be with all of the macro issues? Well, on the other hand, I think if yields start dropping off, I think that's going to be your catalyst for a better market ahead.
You like Wells Fargo, 25 seconds, though. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're going to be one of the three of the big six that's going to report strong year-over-year results. They're going to be up about 40% versus last year. Also, they're trading at about tangible book value, about 8 times earnings, and they have potential because they're cutting costs. They have to because of scandals in the past. And I think ultimately the Federal Reserve will allow them to take the asset cap off, which will allow them to grow. They're sticking with the domestic focus. They're number one and number two in all their markets. Okay. When times are tough, you want to go with the big guys.
Citigroup, JP Morgan, and Wells Fargo are all reporting on Friday the 13th. Not saying anything, but
we're going to be in LA.
We are going to be in LA. Still Friday the 13th.
Yeah, we'll still be doing the show.
Our thanks to David Dietze over at Peapack Private Wealth Management.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 3 to 6 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.